Okay, so here are the questions for our text. And the first thing to notice here is that it's fairly explicit in telling us where we should be reading in the text to try and answer the relevant question. And that's really important because that will allow you to zone in on a particular section and not get overwhelmed by the entire text. And for the sake of our analysis now, we're actually going to focus on question 2. What are Megan's impressions of England in these lines? Making sure that I'm talking about subject terminology, making sure that I'm using quotes, and also bearing in mind that the question is out of 5, so I need to be finding 5 examples. Okay, let's do it. Okay, so the first thing we do is look at what the question is asking of us. It's saying, what are Megan's impressions of England? Now, impressions could be defined by what sort of impact something is having on you. So if you go and watch a movie and someone says, what impression did the movie have on you? Then you might say something like, okay, I was really excited by it, I was disappointed by it, I was impressed by it, any words like that. So let's go through the text now and see whether there are some examples of what sort of impact England had on Megan. So the first line, she found a seat as the train moved off. Now there's no impression there, we're not getting any insight into how she's feeling about what she's seen, we're just getting a description about what's happening on the train. Similarly in the next line, she watched the countryside passing by. Again, no insight into her feelings about what she's seeing. So this was England, she says. Not really an insight either. The next line as well, the old country, no impression of England at this stage. Same when it says the country of Shakespeare and Dickens, not really an impression either. Well, she thought, now you're seeing the real thing. So there's a hint at how she's feeling now, but again, we don't really know. She hasn't articulated what that actually is. But in the next line, you'll notice we do get an example. In terms of landscape, the real thing was disappointing. Okay, here's an actual feeling about what she's seeing. She's disappointed by it. She expected beauty, rolling hills and tranquil valleys, and instead it was flat and wet and a tedious shade of grey. Okay, here's another impression that she has of England. She thinks it was flat and wet and tedious compared to the beauty that she expected. As they approached London, it got dramatically worse. All right, another impression there. They passed mile after mile of ugly blackened buildings. Another impression. She thinks the buildings are ugly, all jammed up against each other like rotten teeth. Another impression right there, linking, comparing the way the buildings look to rotten teeth. A simile, in fact, there. And so close to the railway tracks, she felt she could have reached out and touched them. Now, I guess we could talk about railway tracks as well, because most people are aware that railway tracks are noisy and quite ugly looking. At first, she assumed they were warehouses. All right, so she thinks that the houses are actually warehouses at the start, which I guess has this connotation of them being big and ugly looking and sort of industrial looking. So that's obviously a negative impression she has of England at this point. But then she noticed strips of curtain hanging in some of the windows, and in one she saw a woman holding a baby. Megan was shocked. Okay, a very explicit example there. She's literally telling you what her impression is right there in that line. She hadn't known that places like this existed, but how would she know? She had never been in a city before. Okay, so we're getting quite a few examples here of her impressions. In fact, there's one here, there's two, there's another one there, there's the fourth one is with the rotten teeth, we've got the blackened buildings, we've got the dramatically worse, shades of grey, disappointing. Okay, so in fact we've got 8 examples to choose from, and if we look up at the top here, we actually only need 5. So what we're going to do now is go through and prioritise which are the best examples to be able to discuss, so we can get 5 out of 5 in answering the question, what are Megan's impressions of England? Okay, so we start off with a point, and in this occasion Megan's overall impressions of England were pretty much negative. And this point's going to be relevant for our entire response because it hardly changes. She's always disappointed, or she always has something bad to say about what she's seeing in England. Okay, so let's start off with our really obvious explicit example from the beginning of the text when Megan says that the real thing was disappointing when she's talking about the countryside. Okay, we don't really need to add much more explanation here. It's fairly explicit and obvious that she's not really enjoying herself at this point in time. The next quote we're going to look at is dramatically worse. Okay, so the use of the descriptive language, so let's get some subject terminology in there now. The use of the descriptive language dramatically emphasises Megan's displeasure at the things she is seeing. It suggests that her impressions have actually taken a severe turn for the worst. That word dramatically linked to the idea of a severe turn for the worst. And obviously if this is the case, then her impressions of England are negative. The next really good example to focus on is this one of the ugly blackened buildings. And the use of the adjectives ugly and blackened are really effective because they tell us that Megan is really unimpressed by the aesthetic qualities of the buildings. Okay, she really is thinking that things are looking pretty grim right now. And so again, the impressions that she has of England are negative. Megan then uses the simile jammed up against like rotten teeth, which is effective because the reader can imagine what rotten teeth look like, crooked, damaged and blackened. Okay, so it's really unpleasant to look at. So Megan is obviously unimpressed and in fact disgusted by what she's looking at. It's an excellent comparison, an excellent simile. And our final example that we're going to talk about is when Megan says that she was shocked by the housing. Again, a very explicit example here indicating to us that she has a negative impression of what she's seeing. And note here that I really don't need to explain that much more. Okay, so now that we've done, I really hope that you can see that pretty much at the end of every example that we've discussed, we've always linked it back to the idea that the impressions were negative. Okay, so let's annotate it now and just to double check that I have secured all the marks that I'm eligible for. So let's start off at the top. So here's our point that we're making. The impressions that Megan had of England were negative. Right, so now we've got this idea that Megan says that the real thing was disappointing, so that's my evidence. There's no subject terminology there, and in fact there's no explanation because it's just so obvious, as we talked about earlier on. The next quote talks about the use of the word dramatically. Alright, so there's our quote there, but this time we do have some subject terminology. We've actually got the word descriptive language, which is really useful. But also now you'll notice that we've also got an explanation. So let's just underline that, taking a severe turn for the worst. Then we move on to some more evidence with ugly blackened buildings. We've got more subject terminology with adjectives. And then we've got an explanation here, nicely linking it back to the topic. In our next line, we've got jammed up against like rotten teeth. We've got the use of the simile. And then we've got quite a good explanation all the way through. And then our last quote is when she was shocked. Again, there's not really much explanation going on there needed, and there's no subject terminology, so that's fine. So just to double check, we've got the marks here. So we've got one mark at the top, we've got another one for this explanation here, we've got another one there, that's 3, there's our 4th one, and finally there's our 5th mark. So the examiner is going to have no hesitation in giving us 5 marks. There's subject terminology and the explanations are always linking back to the point that Megan has a negative impression of England.